Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts.
Hey there, everybody. Thanks for joining me for this Sports Psych Concepts presentation. We're going to talk about something that is really relevant for a lot of athletes, and it's really, in many ways, it's how many athletes get introduced to sports psychology, and that's when they get injured. They experience some sort of injury that can be ranging from minor to career ending. And there's a whole range of different things that an athlete might experience in that. But what I want to talk about in this presentation is just the role of psychology and how it can contribute to sports injury on the front end in terms of increasing or decreasing the likelihood that we get hurt, but then also in how we respond to it. And again, it's one of those things that many times when we think about injury, we're thinking that it's this physical thing, and obviously it is, but so much of the downstream ramifications and even things that happen beforehand, before the injury even occurs, are due to psychological factors. And so that's what I'm just going to briefly go over in this short presentation today. So let's start off by just having a brief discussion on the basic considerations here. When we look at sport, there's a lot of demands placed on athletes just to participate, and we can break these down into several different categories. Yes, many of them are physical factors. They're well known and how those can contribute to injury or causes of injury, but we can't ignore the psychological factors as well, okay? Because things like stress and personality, different coping resources that people have, all of those are linked in as well, okay? But ultimately, injury is complex, and there's many things that play a role in it, because you have the biomechanical demands and just how your body is moving and the forces that are placed on that, the physiological demands and how your energy systems are working together and your muscles are supporting the movement and those biomechanical things. You have technical considerations and the skill components. And again, this is one of those things that is usually hugely emphasized in the sporting world. But then we have tactical things that athletes have to think about. I mean, all of these things that they have to try and process and improve, and then you lump in those psychological aspects, which many times are a reflection of how they're processing or dealing with all of these other physical demands or other types of demands that I've mentioned, and they all contribute together. So that's a key basic foundational idea. And so when we're talking about the role of psychology in sports injury, one of the first steps is just increasing our awareness of how that psychology plays into these other things, and that it isn't just the physical etiology of how the injury took place and how they moved and got into a particular position. Now obviously there's examples of injuries that are just induced by trauma, certain situations that maybe were out of the athlete's control and can play into those things. But many athletes or many injuries that athletes experience are they're overuse injuries, they're more subtle, those sorts of things, and the psychology definitely plays a role in that injury risk, and then definitely the recovery. So that's a foundational idea that'll serve us well as we move forward. Now, I want to share something that this is also a foundational idea, but there's so much that could be said about this, and I'm not gonna say all that could be said about it, because there are different models out there of injury, and that can be used to explain the relationship between stress and injury, and just the athletic injury models in general. And so one of them was created by Williams and Anderson in 1998, and like I said, there's other ones out there. But what you'll notice if you look at some of these models and the figures, and you see all the boxes and the arrows and the things that are going on, is that injury is actually pretty complex, and there's a multitude of factors. But if we just want to hone in on the psychological aspects, or stress as a very specific component to that, basically what we're suggesting is that an athlete's response to a potentially stressful situation can mediate the relationship between the situation and that risk of injury. Okay, and so this particular model, the Williams and Anderson model, proposes that you can use interventions to buffer the effects of stress, and then theoretically thereby decreasing the risk of injury that an athlete is exposed to. Okay, so we could come up with different examples there and say, well, we have an athlete that maybe they came from a high-strung household, and that contributed to their personality, and there was just a stressful environment in that home, and maybe they never learned to develop different coping resources, and so they have a particular stress response when they get to practice, or when things get hard or get a little bit chaotic, or things maybe aren't going well. They experience anxiety and how they're appraising the situation, and then they're going to have different physiological responses to that. If they're having anxiety, it could be some sort of somatic response that they're experiencing in their body, or cognitively, and just the types of thoughts that they're experiencing. And then you put them in a potentially stressful athletic situation that could lead to injury, and their risk of injury goes up just because of those stress factors and all of those other contributing things. So in terms of psychological interventions, we're targeting their stress response. We want to help them develop better or more functional cognitive appraisals of what it is that they're experiencing. We want to help them develop better or more effective coping skills so they can manage those physiological responses that they're having. Because we can't really change their personality, we can't change their history, the coping resources that they're coming in with, but we can give them different tools to help them manage that stress response and hopefully reduce their risk of injury. So what are some very specific psychosocial risk factors? I mentioned these with regards to the model that I just described previously, and so I want to dive into these a little bit deeper, because they're important here to have an understanding of these when athletes come in and we're working with them, and how these might contribute to their stress response. So the first one is personality. And there are certain traits that are linked to injury risk. Okay, so for example, trait anxiety. So all of us experience anxiety at different times, but some of us are more prone to anxiety. We're just more anxious people. We experience anxiety that might be out of proportion with different situations. Okay, so that's a personality trait. We may also have tendencies toward perfectionism. We have perfectionist ideals, right? And we could have maladaptive perfectionism that can contribute to our stress response. We could have things like low self-esteem, just not really believing our sort of social barometer of ourselves. We don't think other people like us very much, and so then we don't like ourselves very much, and that's another personality factor. And then just one more example on this would be, how we attribute different things. So we may, if we have a positive attributional pattern and we experience success, we're going to attribute that to an internal locus of control, things that we can control, things that I did, I'll take credit for those things, right? But if we have a certain personality where everything is out of our control, and we attribute those things that happen to us, and it's all out of our control, there's nothing we can do about it, and we have this sort of fatalistic mindset. All of those, that's just another example of a personality characteristic that can be a risk factor for injury. Okay, so personality is one that's important in all those different things. We also have our history of stressors. Okay, so this can be both life event stress, like we've had major life events, we've had the loss of a loved one, maybe we've experienced injuries in the past, those sorts of things. We're going through a relationship breakup. We're going through a moving to a new place. All of those things. Okay, so major life events, either positive or negative, I should mention. I mean, I mostly give examples of what many times we consider to be negative things, but positive life events that can be big things can incur stress as well, right? Just say someone's getting married. You're working with an athlete who's getting married. That can be really stressful. Causes a lot of stress in that planning period. Okay, so it can be those major life events, those big things, and it also can just be daily hassles, the things that we have to wrangle through and work through, the daily slog, the grind. Those things can increase our risk of injury, interestingly enough, okay? Just because there's this sort of low level stress that's just kind of smoldering there all the time. And that is one of those things that has sort of a cumulative effect, right? And then maybe things that shouldn't be we shouldn't respond to as stressfully, would they get blown out of proportion a little bit, right? You know what I'm talking about with that, and so we have those little daily hassle things that we need to consider. Okay, so we have personality, we have our history of stressors, and then we have coping resources here, and this is the last one to consider. And the question really is, do we have adequate coping resources? And this would be examples would be like social support, or do we have mental toughness, which is an attribute that can be developed by working through adversity, right? And continuing to persevere and succeed, finding ways to succeed. It can be specific coping skills that we have, okay? But ultimately, it's just what resources do we have available that can help us buffer the impact of the different stressors and then reduce our injury risk. Because if we have poor coping resources or inadequate coping resources, that is linked to higher risk of injury. Okay, so those are the primary psychosocial risk factors to consider. Okay, so once we have an understanding of some of those psychosocial risk factors and different things that might contribute to the stress an athlete's experiencing, we can then choose psychological interventions, right? But first we need to understand just what is the role of them overall, because if we look at the link between those psychosocial factors and injury, then these psychological interventions, we can view them as a means of prevention or as part of the treatment plan, right? And prevention obviously would be a wonderful thing, so the athletes don't get injured in the first place. It's a great way to think about that. And a lot of times that isn't thought of, right? Well, yeah, I want to prevent injury, so what am I going to do? I'm going to go and strength train, and I'm going to do extra stretching, and I'm going to make sure I rest, and I do these things, right? But we don't often think about, well, what are some psychological interventions that we can do that are also targeting those things? Okay, and maybe we can help prevent them, and certainly use them as part of a treatment plan. And so what we're doing with these interventions, the role here is to try to modify the psychosocial risk factors or the athlete's response to stress that I was talking about before. Okay, and they're going to be best served or designed as complementary approaches to those physical injury prevention or treatment strategies. Okay, so it's still, you don't just throw those other things out and say, well, I'm just going to do psychological interventions to prevent injury or treat injury. We still need to do all those other things. So it's a complementary thing. Okay, so that's the way we need to think about them. We can use them to try and help prevent and as part of these treatment plans, but we are still doing the other things. So we're just adding this complementary psychological approach on there to have an additive effect, hopefully, on those other things is our idea. Okay, and there's a lot of different studies out there that you could explore and read and do a search in the literature that have investigated the effectiveness of these psychological interventions in reducing injury risk in athletes, and that's across a variety of sports. Okay, and so when we think about the type of approach, we want to use an integrative approach, okay, with the intervention. So like I was saying, is It's integrative in the sense that we're still doing those physical prevention and treatment protocols, but then we're also including these psychological. But then the types of psychological interventions, just specifically there, we want to integrate and have a holistic approach of the types of things we're doing. It's not just going to be stress management or relaxation training. Maybe we're also going to build in imagery, can be really powerful for athletes who are injured and coming back from injury. Or it could be cognitive behavioral concepts, right? Or acceptance and commitment therapy principles, all of those things. Mindfulness, self-regulation training. Okay, these are the types of things that we want to include. And so, like I said, you can do some digging in the literature and look and even find some randomized controlled trials and different meta-analyses, different levels of research to support these things. But there is an evidence base that these approaches can reduce injury rates, or at least the severity in athletes, when those athletes participate in these psychological interventions compared to those who don't, right? Or might be in control groups if we're talking research talk there. So some of the things that we're talking about as well: stress reduction, improving confidence and focus. So they have better adherence to their treatment plan, which is a big one, because a lot of times athletes get in there and they just don't really see the connection with their sport, and they don't really want to do all the exercises that their athletic trainer or their physical therapist is prescribing for them. And so we can target that psychologically and help them have better adherence, improve sleep because they have less stress, and so many other examples. So like I said, the role that psychological interventions can play in this can be significant, especially if we're including it as part of an integrative approach. Now, there are some challenges to consider with this, right? And these are the typical ones that we talk about in the sport and performance psychology world. And how do we get people to work on mental skills and focus on these things when that maybe they can get more tangible results and quantifiable results when they're doing the physical things. Okay, so there are several challenges, specific things that we should be aware of and things that we should try and address. And the first one is time. Okay, so despite the fact that there is evidence of effectiveness for these types of programs and using psychological interventions for injury prevention and treatment, it's still not widely adopted. And one of the main reasons may be time. Like, well, how do we fit this in to what it is that we're already doing? If I have to spend 2 hours doing physical therapy a day, and then I've still got to go and attend practice and sit there and watch and help out with different ways that I can help out and be present and all of that. How am I going to fit in the time for this extra intervention, these types of things that we're doing? And so that's why, as I said before, we want to integrate it. Build it into what it is that they're already doing. So if they're going to go stick their foot in an ice bucket because they've got an ankle sprain and that's part of the thing that they're doing, right? We can use that as a mental toughness exercise, because it's uncomfortable, right? It's really uncomfortable to dunk our foot in an ice bucket, especially those first 5 minutes if you've ever done that before. Okay, and so the time factor is, well, we can address that one pretty easily by just building the psychological interventions. And imagery is another one. They're getting manual treatment and all of that, and they can be visualizing little construction workers within their tissues, and they're repairing the damaged tissues. They're taking the gunky junky stuff out, and then they're healing them. Okay, so building that in, the time factor is one that's pretty easy to address. Now, the stigma one, this one, it seems to still be present, but at the same time, not as much, because there has been this increased push. There has been more, let's say, effort toward promoting awareness, and that would be another challenge for implementation on this. Okay, and so the stigma, it's like, well, it is still present, and in some ways, and then other ways maybe not as much as it used to be, because it is certainly more widely accepted that you go and you work on the psychological components, especially in the athletic world. But there seems to be this prevailing component of the stigma that is I don't know how you actually resolve this, because nobody wants to feel like there's something wrong with them, whether that's a physical injury or a mental injury, right? Or just mental component thing that they're working on. A mental challenge would be an example there. And so the mental side of it, it seems like that is just more salient and more prevalent, and so there may still be some work to do to overcome the stigma on that with athletic populations. Really, it's just saying, well, look, you work on the physical stuff, why wouldn't you work on the mental stuff? If you can get 1 to 2% better with that because you did this extra thing that was integrated into everything else you're doing, so it didn't really take any more time, then maybe we could get more results. Okay, and so the lack of awareness, maybe that's tied into the stigma, but really that may be more about there's still a large faction of athletes who don't know that these services are available to them. They don't know how to seek them out, who to go to. They don't know what it entails. And so then maybe they build some stigma around it because of the unknown. So that's certainly tied together. And then the last one to consider is just a limited number of practitioners. There really aren't not that many out there. There's still more of an emphasis on the physical side of things and those types of practitioners working with athletes, and less of an emphasis on having an independent mental performance consultant or mental health practitioner type counselor that's available to athletes. And a big part of that perhaps is because these other practitioners just have more access. They spend much more time. The coaches do, the athletic trainers do. They spend much more time just by virtue of the situation. And so there's been this push in the profession to really, well, do we need more mental performance consultant focused people, or do we just need to train these other people that already have access to the athletes to also work with them on those skills? Okay, and so there's kind of this interesting conundrum with that definitely creates a challenge. So these are things that we want to be aware of, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but certainly things to consider. Now, the last thing I want to mention here is, a few ideas on solutions on this, and how do we overcome some of those challenges. And I mentioned some of this already, but I want to go a little bit more broad here. I mean, the first step would be to generate more research on this, using more rigorous methodologies, things like large-scale randomized controlled trials, more research with different populations like youth athletes, maybe things that are clarifying the specific mechanisms of action. So there's always that, right? The need for more research in the backdrop to sort of guide us in the decisions that we're making as practitioners. So that's a good thing. And then there also could be just creating more programs. And what I mean by this is integrating these psychological interventions into the existing physical prevention programs. And so this goes back to, well, who's qualified and trained to do that? Do we just need to train the practitioners who are already doing the physical programs, or do we need to bring in these specifically trained practitioners who have mental performance or mental skills training, and maybe even some mental health background? What is it that we should be doing there? But ideally, more programs that emphasize this would be a positive thing. Okay, and then so with that, there is a need for more training and outreach for the type of people who do have those connections. So as I mentioned before, coaches have connections with athletes. They're a primary influence. Parents are primary influencers of youth athletes especially, and even collegiate athletes up to that level, and some professionals as well, very much still influenced by their parents. And in support staff, okay, so these are the athletic trainers, the strength and conditioning coaches, right? Maybe you even have some administrators. You have different roles, different people. And so we need more research, and we need more programs that are specifically including these sorts of things. And so how do we do that? Well, we've got to train more people. And so if you can have a ripple effect here to where, all right, we're limited on people who are specifically trained with these skills and understanding the knowledge in these areas. So what can we do then to have more of a ripple effect? Well, if we don't have more of those people, maybe those people can lead some of these programs that are training and doing the outreach with these other individuals who have those touch points, the coaches, parents, and the support staff. And so then maybe they can deliver some of those basic psychological skills training things and work in conjunction with, a sports psychology professional, mental performance consultant, someone who is more specifically trained, and then we have that scaffolding in place to lead to better outcomes on this. Okay, so I mean, there's a need for more communication and education. As a big part of there being wider adoption for this, and so those are just a few thoughts on this that could lead to potential solutions. And so as practitioners, we get out there in the field and we work on our role. These are the types of things that maybe we could make a difference. So with that, thanks for listening to this presentation. That's all I have. I hope you benefited from it and you got some good things from it, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this recording in the Sports Psych Lecture Series. I hope you learned something. More importantly, I hope you learned something that you can apply in your life. Feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify, or visit my website at fehradvantage.com.